So let's summarize the chapter on how to image. There are several windows from which you can view the heart: the peristernal, the apical, the subcostal, which should be performed exactly in that sequence. And then you have additional views, such as the suprasternal view and the right peristernal view, which have their applications in certain clinical situations. There are several peristernal views, so-called long axis views. There's a peristernal long axis view of the left ventricle and a peristernal long axis view of the right ventricle. There are several short axis views, which are approximately 90 degrees to the long axis views. The first one that you would perform is the one at the base, where you have the aorta at the center and the structure surrounding the aorta being the left atrium, the right atrium, right ventricular outflow tract, and the pulmonic artery. If you tilt the transducer downwards, you would get a short axis view of the mitral valve, with the mitral valve here at the center and the LVOT. If you tilt the transducer even further, you get a short axis view where you have portions of the mitral apparatus visible. And if you tilt the transducer even further down, you get a short axis view where you have the papillary muscle. The short axis view are important to assess the function of the aortic valve, for example, and left ventricular function and the mitral valve. The apical views are performed from the apex, which lies somewhere in the region of the fifth intercostal space. The probably most important view being the four-chamber view, with the left ventricle, left atrium, and right atrium visible. And then you can rotate the transducer around the center axis, and you would get the two-chamber view and the apical long axis view. And if you tilt the transducer upwards, you would get the five-chamber view. There are special additional views which I find very helpful for imaging. This is the so-called coronary sinus view, which you get by tilting the transducer in opposite direction than to the five-chamber view, and thereby you visualize the coronary sinus. You can place the transducer in a more lateral position, and thereby you would get a view where the septum points to the left of the screen. This view is very helpful to assess right ventricular function. You would see the right ventricle very nicely. You can also rotate the transducer clockwise and thereby get a view where you have a very nice visibility of the lateral walls here. The subcostal views are very important as well. You can get a view which is very similar to the four-chamber view, but this time you have the septum slanted more towards the right of the screen. You can see the pericardium very nicely and the four chambers. Short axis views can be performed from a subcostal approach, just the same as for a peristernal approach. Again, a very similar view than we've seen before. The short axis view at the base with the aorta in the center. We have short axis views of the left ventricle, and we can perform a view which allows us to see the vena cava inferior as it enters the right atrium. This view is particularly helpful for the assessment of right atrial pressure and other pathologies which involve the inferior vena cava. The suprasternal view is a view that you will need in special situations, in particular if you want to look at retrograde flow or dilatation of the aorta. And the view shows the following segments. You have the aortic root with the ascending part and the descending part, and the right pulmonary artery which undercrosses the aortic arch. In summary, it's also important that you always follow a standard protocol. Start with the peristernal window, then switch to the apical windows, and then perform the subcostal window. Always use all standard views that I showed you, but feel free to also use other views, atypical views, and that you focus exactly on the pathology or the region of the heart that is of interest to you. M-mode still has its importance, but basically only in two applications. First, measuring the size of the aorta in the left atrium, and second, measuring the left ventricle the septum, and left ventricular function. Doppler should also be performed in every routine, especially across the mitral valve, especially across the aortic valve, but you can also use it for the tricuspid valve, and you can even perform tissue Doppler. Doppler allows you to measure velocities across the valve or even within the heart, and also timing of events, and color Doppler helps you to note where turbulences are, which then again might help you in assessing the velocity or the pathology there.